The Minnesota Legislature could go into a special session as soon as next week, depending on the call of Governor Tim Walz. The session was originally to deal with unfinished business in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. But now, criminal justice reform will also be high on the agenda if a special session is called. Producer Greg Grell talked with Representative Liz Olson on the legislative reaction to the Minneapolis police killing.
What a terrible tragedy. George Floyd should still be alive. We all, 2 weeks ago saw a video that I think shook us all to our core. And we saw a black man killed at the hands of police. We know that a camera was rolling that time, but we also know that it happens far more often than most of us know about. And so it really, I think, hit a chord for so many people who've lived this experience for years and years and years, and really put a call to action out that this has to stop, that enough is enough. And to have this happen, whether it doesn't matter where or what police department, that we know this exists across our nation. And so this is a long history of unjust behavior and systematic racism and white supremacy that have really come to a head, I think, and we're seeing that with the way people are rising up, that the years of pain and hurt and anger are really showcasing in the way people are coming together in the streets and on social media and other places to organize their voices loudly to ask for change, to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And we've obviously seen that in Minnesota, and it's been a real call to action for me personally as a legislator. What can I do in this moment?
And of course, we've had moments like this in our past, but there does seem to be something different about this. Like, this might be a real turning point. Do you feel that as well?
I definitely do. I mean, I think that we're seeing the scale of just the way this is, we're 2 weeks in, and where there's people still, on the Capitol grounds. We have National Guard surrounding our state capitol. The first time we've had to have something like this happen in our history as a state. So I do think it's time. And I think the fact that it happened on top of a pandemic where so many of the injustices of our society were being laid bare there. And then we had this happen as well, that it's really, there is no going back. If we're going to rebuild our state after a pandemic, after a killing of a black man, we need to do it in a more just way than we've ever seen before. So I think this is a time for us to reconcile our history and our future, and is a time for us as Minnesotans to really be on the right side of things. So I do believe it's a tipping point, and I'm hopeful that good comes of this. And I think that's why so many people are being relentless in their lifting up of their voice to make sure we don't go back to normal.
Now, you just recently attended a news conference in St. Paul's Rondo neighborhood, a historically black neighborhood, to announce some new legislation, or at least efforts to introduce new legislation. First off, what were the emotions like? That had to have been quite a moment.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing our DFL House Caucus and the Senate DFL have been really conscious of in this moment is to lift up the voices of those most impacted, which are our Black legislators, our legislators of color, our Indigenous legislators, to make sure that they're leading in this moment. And so yesterday was really a show of that, where we were in the neighborhood of Rena Moran, Chair Moran, African-American woman, who kicked off the press conference, and it was all led by people of color, Indigenous voices, primarily our Black legislators. So it was a really powerful moment for all of us to come together around solutions, but around the pain and the hurt that so many of not only our legislators feel, but the communities they represent. And so it was a really powerful and emotional moment. And it was also, we were there for action. Our job as legislators is to come up with the solutions we can enact at the state level. So as a white legislator from greater Minnesota, it was good to be there and stand behind my colleagues and to really stand there and to lift up their voices and their solutions.
Now, speaking of northern Minnesota and your district, what have you heard from your constituents and the people that you've been listening to in our region since all of this has happened?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's really ultimately my job, is to be the voice of my constituents, the 40,000 people I represent. And I've heard loud and clear, a voice like our community cares about one another. And just even on my walk today, I walked by several, homes in the Denfeld neighborhood that had visible signs of solidarity with what's happening, whether it's justice for George Floyd or it was a Black Lives Matter sign. I could see that visibly in my community. And people have emailed. I've never had so many constituent contacts, which if you're a constituent listening and you're not hearing back right away, my voicemail it shut down over the weekend. I had so many calls. So we're trying to get through everything and sift out who is constituents and who is not, maybe calling from other states even. But, I've heard loud and clear that our communities care about one another, and that means everybody. And so whether, we're predominantly white city, but we still have like major injustices here. And we have communities of color within my neighborhood that are feeling the pain, the anger, and we have people that aren't, part of the communities of color that want to be in solidarity and want to be allies and are really raising up their voices. So I've heard a lot from my constituents about this issue and really want accountability and want to make sure that we're enacting state level solutions to this issue.
And speaking of state level solutions, what do you hope and think the legislature can do? How can the legislature be part of the solution to this ongoing issue?
Absolutely. There are, and this was probably touched on, a little bit from what we were talking about with what was unveiled yesterday. So our People of Color and Indigenous Caucus around, as well as myself and other legislators, our Speaker of the House, we stood behind a set of reforms that were a package of legislation that we believe would really bring justice to George Floyd and would really help the solution. And they include a variety of things coming from reform the investigation and prosecution of officer-involved deaths and wrongdoing situations. So we have a number of things that we could envision being enacted into law that would help that part. We increase accountability around police and transparency. There's a number of things we could do around that specific topic regarding this. We could raise the conduct standards for officers and have more excellence, diversity, training, peer-to-peer support for those that go through these situations. So it's not about leaving police officers high and dry. It's actually giving tools and accountability and support to be able to implement a lot of the change we want to see. It's about officers partnering with the communities they serve and building those relationships. And I think in Duluth, we're a little bit better at that than perhaps other police departments have been, and that we're, talking about what it's going to take to repair and rebuild community in a variety of ways that we've seen impacted in this way. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And there's a number of ways that we can do it, but we have a set of legislation we're putting forward, some of which we've already voted on, that has been passed in the House side of things, and others which will be new in response to this. And a number of these too, I should mention, the Department of Public Safety and the Attorney General had a special task force that met over the last year that came up with a number of solutions, and that was with all the stakeholders at the table. And so a number of these aren't just coming out of thin air. They've really been talked about and vetted with a broad stakeholder group too.
Now, as far as when this might happen, there is a special session presumably that will be occurring. Do you see some of these issues now coming to the forefront for perhaps action as soon as this summer?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Our Speaker of the House, Melissa Hortman, has said so much that, any special session would involve a response to this. It's unclear. We obviously have a divided government, and we have a DFL controlled House and a Republican controlled Senate. And I don't know what that looks like from the Republican Senate, but we clearly have our package that we've put out, and, whether some of that can get across the finish line in a divided government or some may take some time to work out remains to be seen. But that is definitely why I believe, one of the reasons we'd be called back into a special session is to address this systemic issue that we need to take care of.
And speaking of divided government, one of the things that seems to happen whenever an incident happens in the way our world is these days is that these events have become politicized. Do you see common ground? Do you think that you can get together with your colleagues on the Republican side to come up with some good solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are things that we will be able to get done in a divided government that we agree on. As I mentioned, some of these things aren't new or coming just out of the Justice for George Floyd, but they are coming out of stakeholder groups, kind of a broad spectrum of people, Republican and Democrat agreeing. Our House Public Safety bill this year was really worked on by a number of stakeholders that had some of these on there, some of these pieces on there already. So I do believe there is common ground. I think there's some of us that would like it to go further, and that may not be the case this session in a divided government, but I do think we could get something done, and I'm hopeful we do get something done.
All right. Well, Representative Liz Olson, DFL Duluth, the House Majority Whip, thank you very much and good luck going forward.
Thank you so much, Greg.